Good evening and welcome to Undercover. This is a show that looks between the covers of books by Missoula area authors. My name is Dave Pauli. I'm director of the Missoula Public Library, and this show is jointly produced by the library and by Fact and Fiction Bookstore. And our guest tonight is Joe Rainbolt. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Dave.
Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Joe's newest book is called The Last Cowboy, Twilight Era of the Horseback Cowhand. And Joe, to write this book, you interviewed a lot of authentic cowboys. I understand that some of them were pretty advanced in age. But I want to know, first of all, where did you find all these guys? How did you meet all these fellows?
Well, that's a good question. What happened was I knew the old guys before I took on the subject. I had known some old cowboys who happened to retire to the Bitterroot Valley, where I was living for a long time. And I kind of got squeezed between the myth of the kind of little snivelly, they were trying to debunk the cowboy on the one hand, and then there was always this romantic idea that I was sort of a victim of. And so I knew these old guys who had worked as horseback cowhands in the early part of the 20th century, no, the 19th. And I was thinking about that today. I don't know when I decided I wanted to set the record straight, but I thought, well, they don't fit either category. They're real people, and they had an interesting kind of lifestyle during those days. They were cowhands. So then I decided to start tape recording and write more things down. And but I had been hanging out with these guys before I decided to write the book.
I see. It seemed to me that it was a real art to get the material you got from the interviews. I mean, some of these fellows, maybe not all, but some of them seemed like they were kind of reticent to talk about.
Oh, yeah. And I am from a Scandinavian background, so probably, definitely the most difficult person to interview would be Art Wall.
He came from Norway originally.
Yeah, he came from Norway, and I can't really remember a lot of the dates and facts. You have to read the book because I don't want to start making things up, but he was only 14, I think. I haven't read the book for a while.
Yeah.
And he was great, and let's see. I wrote a column for the Missoulian called An Elephant in Every Yard, and I wrote that in the 70s. And Art came to my attention because of that column. But not because I interviewed Art. I interviewed his landlady. And she let out rooms to people. And there was this old cowboy, and then someone called and mentioned his name again. And also I was involved with Michael Korn, who was at that time the director of Montana Folklife. And I was hired to co-produce a record on the old-time cowboys after I was really into the subject. So I got to travel around the state, and I would, I'd get really excited. I'd see the guys, and they'd have this certain look, like in Miles City. And so I'd talk to these guys, and their stories were they all, came out the same, more or less. And so I knew that no one was just handing me a line, that this is the way it was, at least for that era.
And well, were there any particular interview techniques that you had to use to get these stories? Or?
No, I really enjoy talking to old-timers, and I like listening to their stories, not having to worry about talking about myself. They're just so accepting, and I just really enjoyed it. And I was real fortunate because probably the main, don't you think that probably the main informant was Tony Grace? I mean, there's 7 old-timers in this book that are the major characters, but Tony retired. He's 102 now. He'll be 102 on June 10th. He retired at about age 90 to Darby, which was only, I don't know, 10 miles from where I had a ranch, or where I was living on a ranch. And so I would just drive to Darby and just spend the afternoon with Tony, and he's got an amazing kind of grasp of the whole picture, and that really helped because I was getting, like, Joe Hughes was real poetic. His dad was Marcus Daly's gardener. Everyone knows Marcus Daly, the Copper King, and then Joe grew up near the Daly estate, and he grew up with horses, and he was a real Irish poet, and then Art was the Norwegian who, no. I was very patient with Art. So anyhow, then I happened to go up to Juneau. When my daughter graduated from Hellgate, I went up there to kind of rewrite, finish the book, and get some solitude. And I happened to meet an old-time deputy sheriff from Wyoming, Donovan McGee, and so I added him to the book. And it just sort of happened. It was a great book to write because it was just the way it happened.
And what about the whole idea of there being a cowboy code? Now, many of them, as you said, try to debunk the mythology that's been built up by Hollywood about cowboys. But there was some kind of a code of, I don't know if you want to call it chivalry or exactly what, but I noticed a few months ago I read Nanny Alderson's book, A Bride Goes West, and she was talking about how she was never afraid to be alone with all these cowboys that were on their ranch because they respected respectable women so much.
Yeah.
Is that?
I
just wondered about that.
Yeah, I haven't read that particular book. It sounds good, but there is a chapter in The Last Cowboy where I did attempt to sort of get to the heart of the code, but none of them would talk about it. I mean, they didn't think they had a code. They didn't ever know of a list that was written. But then when I kept asking the same questions and comparing notes, there was definitely a standard of cow camp. You could call it etiquette, because all the myths about the hard drinking, and cow camps were very quiet places. And like Tony said, these people were cow chaperones. They wanted to get them to market fat. They didn't want to run them all. They didn't want to have stampedes or shootouts. There weren't any guns.
Right.
Cowboys didn't even own their own horses. They had a string. So anyhow, through asking certain kinds of questions, I did, I think, pretty much get down the kinds of rules. For one thing, and this was really instilled in me by these old-timers, they did never badmouth the outfit or the boss. They'd quit before that. So when people are really complaining to me, I know it's not always easy to find another job, but I'll say, well, you know, why don't you quit? If I get so tired of people complaining, because, you know, we're sort of in the age of whiners. And so I really got a kick out of all these guys, and they worked for very little money.
And under great hardships. I mean, there's a whole chapter in here about some of the injuries. And one guy was drugged by a horse for 24 hours, and he survived.
It's crazy, and we have to remember that underneath all of this and all the richness and the stories and everything was this love of horses.
They had to,
and being on horseback. And that's another thing, having been around horse owners, and I prefer my mountain bike. I'll ride horses, but I'm not going to pretend like I'm a cowgirl. But my kids ride really well. But anyhow, I'd always assumed until I started really talking to these guys that cowboys were ornery to their horses, that they mistreated their horses. And that was so far from the truth, because they depended on their horses. And as you remember from reading the book, there's some hilarious stories about how they would retire a horse. And it was kind of an interesting way to interview, because it wasn't that I asked a whole lot of straightforward questions. I would just listen, and then they would mention the name of a horse. They always remember the names of their horses, and I'd say, you mean you let that horse be around camp? You told me that horses couldn't come into camp. You know, you couldn't ride your horse. Oh yeah, well that one was retired. And then I'd say retired. You know, so I would get these little jewels just by listening to what they were telling me. So they did actually retire their horses, and they'd let them, some of them, special ones, hang around camp. And but it was a fun.
There was almost a mystical union that came through in that chapter about the horses between the
Great, I'm glad that came through,
horse.
Because they. And one time I asked Tony if cows were as dumb as everybody says there, and he thought for a minute and said, probably not. That might have been in the book. They you know, they hang out in herds, but if you got it off by itself, like you would a horse, and you really just hung out with it and got to know it, it probably wouldn't be so dumb. I thought that was a really good comment, because it's kind of how people are too.
Yeah. Well, in the introduction to the book, there is some discussion of the whole idea of the cowboy actually being on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic scale. The pay was low, the work was long and hard and dirty, but not one of these guys you interviewed had that view of it at all, I don't think.
Joe Hughes would say to me often, I don't know what you want to talk to me about cowboys for, because we were in the lowest rung, you know, and he'd go on and on, but he was proud, and he was proud of his work and of being a cowhand. For one thing, they all chose the work. It was their choice, and it was just like, you know, I can't say it the way they said it, but it was like the freedom got to a guy. And even Art, old Art, the Norwegian, as you notice, there were a few times when he was really eloquent about what it meant to have that kind of a lifestyle and to breathe in. I mean, they lived into their 90s, all of them, except Kenny surprised me, the youngest. And I just saw his wife a couple days ago, and he died, I think, a year ago, and I didn't know, I knew he died in the backyard, and she said, well, he always told me he was going to die mowing the lawn, and I guess that's what killed him, was mowing lawns.
But there must be a fair number of instances of cowboys dying on the job from some of the accidents you described.
Exactly.
One guy broke his neck and didn't even know it was broken for years.
Right. That was a true story. Yeah. Because I knew his doctor in the Bitterroot, and he was 17, and when he discovered it, what was it, 50, 60 years later, and the doc said, how'd you break your neck? Yeah, I figured that a lot of them died off young. They had to have. And I was lucky enough to meet some of the survivors, and I wouldn't be as lucky now because, well, the book took a long time. I took my time with it. Yeah. So the only surviving cowhands are Tony Grace and Donovan McGee. And there must be something being born June 10th, because both of them are born June 10th.
Well, what about the hold that whole myth seems to have on the public at large? You know, you explain in here that the era of the open range was really very short, very condensed, and it wasn't long before there were homesteaders and there was barbed wire going up. So that era was really quite short. Why is it that we have such romanticized it or have such strong feelings about it, do you think? Well,
I can only speak from my own personal point of view. Part of it must be the man on horseback and the early movies that didn't really portray the cowboy the way he was, but still gave us that idea about the West. And as soon as I was able to, I grew up in the Midwest, but when I was a very young adult, I scurried out west. And I think a lot of us just grew up with this idea that the West is a good place.
So it had a hold on you, too.
Yeah.
It brought you out here.
Yeah. And I think in the process of interviewing these guys and getting to know a lot of, I also had, I mentioned I also, there are some Native American cowboys, and there's some Indian cowboys, and I became very real, very grounded. I'm not saying, I am sentimental about these old timers because I think they're great. I think they're kind of heroic. But I became very grounded, and so I lost a lot of my romantic notions about the early West. But I don't know. I don't know what the hold is. It's great. I mean, the clothing, even though, like I said in the book, it was plain, basic fabrics, but the leather, silk, cotton, wool, and the way they dressed up when they were going to town, and it had a whole lot of stuff going on that makes it kind of a fun myth to go along with. You know.
Well, I grew up in the 50s, so all the movies and TV shows I saw were probably really rankled these fellows, I imagine, because that was a pretty unrealistic view.
Yeah.
Of the cowboy.
They take it with humor, but like Kenny Trowbridge would say, Christ's sake, we never acted like that or or looked like that.
Yeah. What have there been any Hollywood films that were more close to the truth, do you think, than what I saw as a kid?
Well, I read Lonesome Dove by, what's his name, Larry
McMurtry.
McMurtry? I can never pronounce his last name. And I think a lot of, like Guthrie's Way West, and I think a lot of books really portray these fellas. And you probably noticed in the introduction, K. Ross Toole, our great Montana historian, he told me don't debunk the myth that these guys really stood for something. I could, you know, pick the book up and quote what Ross said because, but anyhow, he and a lot of other people did write about the qualities that I do find enduring, qualities of open-handedness and the generosity that these fellows still display, and the lack, you know, the lack of materialism, the something more basic going on than.
Right. In fact, they didn't ever seem to be concerned about how much money they were earning, or
of course, they were young.
Right.
And in those days, you didn't find any married cowboys. All of these fellows, except for Joe Hughes, all of them married late, and so they didn't have the responsibilities. But I think a lot of it's, you know, I hope that the qualities, I don't know if I've expressed those qualities at all in this interview, but the qualities that I admire in these old, they could be like role models, that we could create our own heroes from the facts rather than relying on what came out of the dime novel and the movie, because just the way they live their lives and the things they say and the humor and the kind of understanding that comes out. And now I think I'm sounding sort of romantic, but
that's okay.
It's okay.
Well, in fact, some of the popularization, the dime novels that you talked about that a little bit, were written by people who'd never been west.
Oh, sure.
So there was kind of a mythology built up there based on.
And I probably should mention, I didn't analyze in this book or, you know, try to do what I'm doing now. That's why it's hard for me. I let them speak. And so I'd let them speak through, there's a chapter on songs and a chapter on stories, and there's a chapter I really enjoyed on art, because I got to know J.K. Ralston really well, the Hall of Fame.
And in fact, they said
cowboy.
they could look at a piece of Western art and tell you, a lot of these fellows could look at it and tell you whether it was authentic or not.
Sure, by the details. And they really liked Charlie Russell, and so I really stayed out of the role of trying to interpret.
It's not some kind of an academic treatise on the cowboy. It's
yeah, let them tell their story, and they told it with a lot of verve. In fact, I'm delighted that I just saw Tony recently, and he'll be 102 on June 10th, and I told him that I was really glad that he lived long enough to see this book come out. But he said he's going to be around for a while. But I was pleased because he was happy. You know, he would just keep telling me things like, "What is she going to get it straight?" and why does she want to know? Actually, Tony understood why I wanted to know, but Joe Hughes never did. He died wondering why in the world I wanted to know all this, because it was just his life. You know?
Yeah, but those were unique lives.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Actually, a very small number of people participated in that kind of life, I guess.
Well, yeah, especially now in 1992, there's not very many of them left that participated in that.
Are there any working cowboys left?
Oh, I don't know that. Oh, yeah, I imagine there are. The modern cowboys and on the big, even down in the Big Hole, there's a lot of working cowhands, but they would be married and they don't have to have the kind of singular lifestyle that the working cowhand of the early part of the century. I probably should mention that one of the reasons I felt it was important to put this together is because, as far as anything I had read, the whole era had ended with this last devastating storm that Charlie Russell did. I always forget the year. It's in there.
1888 or something like that. Yeah.
And so that's why I went to talk to Ross and Ross Toole and said, should I even try to write this book? Because I know that these guys were cowboying in the early part of this century. And he said, yeah, he said it was the historians that pulled a convenient curtain and said this is the end of the cowboy era. He says in reality people keep living, they don't hear what the historians do it later.
Right.
So that people kept living this lifestyle. It did change a lot after World War I, but I got that all in the book because Art Wall came back from World War I and told me how things had changed, and then he went on the road with his Yellowstone Rodeo Company because it was no longer the kind of lifestyle. So even though the book says 1900 to 1940, and it does cover that era, it really, a lot of it just takes place before World War I, the old style. They even had some cattle drives.
And one of the fellows you interviewed, I can't remember who now, actually became a horse broker. And was that during World War I? He took horses to Chicago and sold them. And
oh yeah, several of the old fellows that I interviewed had gone to Chicago during World War I because the Italian and the French and the English were all buying horses for their cavalries. And so it wasn't that unusual. In fact, it could be a topic for a whole book because it's very interesting. And then they'd send cowboys over to Camp Lewis, Washington, here in the West, to break horses. It's a really interesting topic because things have changed so quickly in this country. It's hard for us to believe that they were using horses and training horses for war.
I was a little surprised by that.
I was surprised when I first heard it too. I said, "Oh, you mean they actually were drafted and went in to work with horses."
Who better would know about them?
It was a good way to do it.
Wow. What about, I want to ask one question about putting all this material together. I mean, it must be kind of a difficult job to edit it down and decide what goes where.
That was the job I took on when I went up north to Alaska. And it was. I remember it as being hard, just the process of deciding what to use. But I got away from collecting because as long as I was here and these fellows were still alive and vital, I had to pull my own curtain, end my own era somehow. And then I met Donovan McGee and added him to the book. But it's probably different for every writer. And it is. It's the collecting and the writing it down is gravy. That's fun. And then the actual editing. And I had a good editor to work with this past winter at the press, at the American Geographic, Montana Magazine's press, and it helps to get a perspective. Do you want to hear what I cut out?
Yeah, sure.
I had a whole, I went over to the archives to do a little digging, and I found these wonderful little leather journals that Teddy Blue Abbott, from the book We Pointed Them North with Helena Huntington Smith, that he had written, and they were just in this cardboard box. This was quite a long time ago. I was doing some research for the Montana Folklife Project with Michael Korn, and I was just enthralled because it told the story of his sweetheart, and he didn't use her name, he used a little brand in the book. And this was earlier. This was like the late 1800s, and I Xeroxed it all off and found out who had donated it and got permission, and the reason we decided not to use it is because it was earlier than he wasn't alive, didn't exactly fit in. But I bet I spent, a good 6 months just getting that material, and maybe someday I'll do something with it. But it turned out, when I met J.K. Ralston working on this project, and I asked him, I didn't look up any of the things in books. I asked him who Teddy Blue Abbott's wife was, and it turned out it was Granville Stewart's daughter. And that it was a fun way. It's kind of maybe a backward way for me, but I like to get material from the people who lived it. And that way I don't have to do any bibliographies or footnoting or anything because I was fortunate enough to get it right from them. So anyhow, that whole story of Teddy Blue, which was a real love story, was something that I cut out from the book.
There's a little bit of romance in here, though, about how they met their wives, but as you said, most of them were single quite a while. And
in fact, Art and Tony were both 40 and married women a lot younger and outlived them. And a lot of them did just stay with this life until, and then the life was ended anyhow because of all the changes and the mechanization and whatever.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on our show. And the name of the book again is The Last Cowboy, Twilight Era of the Horseback Cowhand, 1900 to 1940. And I think a lot of people in Montana particularly will find this of interest, but people all over the country probably will.
Thanks, Dave.
Do you, what about promoting it? Are you kind of low-key about that, or how are you going to go about that?
Oh, well, I'd do anything that presented itself.
Okay.
I'm writing a lot right now on some other projects, but book parties, and I don't know how much you want to mention.
Whatever. Do you have a plan right now, or?
Well, the press has sort of overview of the different places in Montana, and I would be delighted if the book had a lucky break and was reviewed nationally. I mean, you know, New York Times Book Review, who knows?
Yeah.
Somebody might pick it up. It certainly is a topic that appeals.
I think so.
Nationally.
Widely, not just the West, but yeah.
So we'll see. I've had some phone calls from friends that have seen the book from around the country, and you know, I don't have many friends in high publishing places, but I might. I might find some.
We wish you a lot of success.
Thank you, Dave.
Joe Rainbolt's been our guest today. I'd like to say a couple of things about what's going on at the library this summer. Our summer reading program is in full swing, and we're really happy to have kids participating in that. We like to think that we help kids enjoy reading during the summer, helps their academic skills, also a wonderful pastime for them. Also, I wanted to mention our couple of programs that we do year-round. One is called Book Babies, and that is a program for parents and infants from birth to 24 months. We do a special program the first Wednesday of every month, and parents bring their children. We do some songs, stories, and games for kids, and we also have a special speaker for the parents. That's a rather unique program. I think we're the only library in Montana doing a program quite like that. So if you want to know more about that, call us at 721-2665. That's 721-BOOK. Also, we have a book discussion group for adults that's going on year-round. We meet on the third Thursday of every month at 7 o'clock. And we have some pretty lively discussions of a number of different books, fiction and nonfiction. If you'd like to get involved in that, you can call me at the library. Again, that's 721-2665. We do have spaces. There is a nominal fee that we charge to get the books for you. That's a pretty enjoyable program. We really are having a lot of fun with that. Again, I'd like to remind everyone that the library is open year-round the same hours. There seems to be a little confusion about that sometimes. We're open Monday through Saturday, and 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday, we're open till 9 in the evening, and Friday and Saturday, we open until 6 in the evening. If you want to know our hours, you can always call us, and we'll let you know. Also, if you need to call on a Sunday or a time when we're closed, 728-5900 will get you a recording that tells you what hours we're open. So again, I'd like to encourage everyone to have their children participating in the summer reading program. And again, I want to thank Joe Rainbolt for being our guest on Undercover. The name of the book is The Last Cowboy. A lot of people in Montana are going to enjoy that, I know, and people all over the country probably. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome to Undercover, the show that looks between the covers of books by Missoula area authors. My name is Dave Pauli. I'm director of the Missoula Public Library. And this show is jointly produced by the Missoula Public Library and Fact and Fiction Bookstore. Tonight we have a special treat. I think we haven't had someone who writes quite in this vein before on the show. Our guest is Bryan DiSalvatore, who is in the stable of writers for the New Yorker magazine, probably the most prestigious magazine in the country. And we're going to be talking to Bryan about the work he does for them and some other things too. Bryan?
How are you doing, Dave?
Welcome to our show.
Thank you. My pleasure.
The first thing I want to ask you is how one becomes a New Yorker writer. I mean, how did that all come about for you?
Well, it's out of a bad movie, but I was here. It was the fall of '87. I was pretty miserable and broke. I was suddenly a bachelor and without any money. Some friends came over to watch the World Series, and the morning after the last game, I was doing the dishes and started thinking that we might have been the only group of people in America who were eating buffalo hump roast and watching the World Series. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting, and I made a little piece, a talk of the town. It's about a 1,000-word piece at the beginning of the magazine that talked about our softball team here in Missoula, the Montana Review of Books, and how we were rooting for the underdogs because we had had a championship season, and that year we had fallen in the ranks, and we rooted for the underdog Kansas City Royals, and they won. And I sent it off blind over the transom, and Mr. Shawn, William Shawn, called me back 2 days later and said, we like this, we're going to run it, and would you come and visit us in New York? And so we like you a lot.
Great. So
suddenly, after 20 years, I was an overnight success.
Well, wonderful. So you went to New York then, and what, had some kind of substantive talks with the people there?
I went there, and they put me up in a hotel and had my appointment with Mr. Shawn, who's a tiny, very formal man, I mean, the most prestigious publisher in American history. And I was so nervous. I mean, it's sort of like entering a sacrosanct place.
Right.
And his couch was a little bit low, and I went there and went, whoa, and I thought I was supposed to be here, but the couch knew it was about this much further down. I went, boom, like that. And he said how much he liked it, and would I like to write something more for them, and I proposed an article about dynamite. And so it was getting the nod from the Pope.
Wow. Well, about that article, the dynamite article, and in the other articles, I wonder what the sort of the relationship or the symbiosis is between your ideas and their editorial decisions. I mean, do you go to them and say, here's an idea, and do you have to have some kind of a draft, and then they approve it, or how does that work?
The New Yorker is absolutely different from most magazines in these long nonfiction pieces. There's no deadline. Most magazines will say, we need this by such and such a date. The New Yorker has never done that. They are very vague in their outline. I gave him 2 paragraphs. I talked about some dynamite that I knew, old dynamite that was up in Potomac at Onyx Smith's house, her ranch, and said, this could go up at any time. I'm interested in this. I'd like to talk about dynamite. I don't think it exists anymore. Or I didn't think. It does, as it turned out.
Right.
And he said, fine, go ahead. And they gave me some expense money, and 9 months later, I turned in a a piece. And there's very little editorial direction once you begin. When I wrote later on a piece about Merle Haggard, a profile.
Right.
And all I did at that time, Bob Gottlieb was the editor, and I just said, Bob, I'd like to do a profile on Merle Haggard. He said, go for it. Wow. It's a extraordinary freedom for a writer. Yeah. I mean, most magazines will direct your traffic before you have even gotten into the car. The New Yorker says, go and do this. What they have always been is they are interested in your writing and your approach to the subject rather than the subject itself. That certainly is part of it, but this can work to your disadvantage. I spent a year writing a piece about the National Football League Player Association. It was supposed to be about a 20,000-word profile of Gene Upshaw. I got fascinated with the subject. I turned in 70,000 words on the history of sports unionism in America, and they said,
oh, that's what I was going to ask. There's a chance you could turn this in and not.
Yeah, I mean, I shunted myself off onto a different track, and I just kept going and going, and they said, it's irreparably bad.
Meaning they just couldn't use it based on what they felt was appropriate for them?
There was nothing to be done. I mean, it was like trying to fly a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Nope, can't do it. So that is the danger of this, of any freedom, certainly this editorial freedom. The Dynamite piece was a classical New Yorker piece. It ran in 2 parts, and it told, at least I think, everything that anyone wanted to know and probably more than that about dynamite.
I learned a tremendous amount. I didn't know that dynamite was such an instrumental force in the shaping of civilization.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a part of that that didn't get in, which was I thought, really lovely short biography of Alfred Nobel, who was a very tortured and unfortunate man, even though he was so wealthy. I mean, he started the Nobel Prizes and the Peace Prize, but he was very much and I've never seen this in print before, a peace through strength sort of guy, and he was coming up with biological warfare, and so he was not sort of the misunderstood saint that a lot of people, but that got taken out. It was, I mean, I suffered through that piece. I mean, that was I went to Birmingham, Alabama.
Oh, yes.
To go to the dynamite factory.
One of the few left in the country.
Yep, and that's closed now. I mean, I was there about a year before. To Delaware, to the DuPont Library, where they have lots of information about that. Utah, I went out to I-90, where as you enter Seattle now, there's a new tunnel, and I did actually help blow the son of a gun up, you know.
Yeah.
And just running all over the place, watching them blow up Rainbow Bend up there on 200.
Yeah, and all of that's described. Well, so your research is certainly not limited to sitting in a library. I mean, in all your articles, I mean, you went on the road with Merle Haggard.
Yep.
You went on the road with this long-distance trucker on 2 really long transcontinental trips.
I'm not very good at library research. I get impatient. I don't, I mean, actually, one of these days when I get a book out, I'm going to be able to get a big paragraph of thanks to you folks down there, because it's all started there. I mean, even as basic as the Encyclopedia Britannica and a few books, and then you get bibliographies. But I get impatient at doing the paperwork, and my strength is anecdotes and relating it to it. But God, I mean, you have to, the flesh and blood of a story has to be grounded in fact. I mean, I went through a lot of chemistry textbooks in that dynamite piece.
Yeah.
And I don't know anything about chemistry.
Well,
I still don't.
I was impressed. I learned a lot, and I didn't feel like I was being overwhelmed by the. Well, but also, I sensed from reading the Merle Haggard piece, and even more, I think, from reading the piece about the long-distance trucker, that you liked that. I mean, you were kind of reveling in that whole experience of being out there on the road.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, it's. I don't know. I've always liked trucks. And there I am in a big old truck driving all over the country. And it's a perfect place for interviews.
Yeah.
Because, you know, where are you going to go? If you miss a question or you want to come back to it, well, the son of a gun is still sitting there. You know, and Lonnie, there he was, you know. Let's see, I think I asked you in West Virginia, now we're in Oklahoma, but remember when I asked you that? And it's great fun. I mean, with Merle, though, I mean, it about broke my health. I mean, I wake up early, and I usually go to sleep kind of early, but those guys give a concert at 8 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night. They get done at midnight. They unwind. They get on the bus. They're still charged up. They'll play poker, talk, watch the TV, watch a video. So suddenly at 6 o'clock, there were 10 people on the bus. I was the 10th, and there were 9 bunks. I was sleeping on the little banquette.
Yeah.
Eating crappy food.
Well, you know, I must admit that I learned a lot. I didn't know anything about Merle Haggard when I started the article, and I learned a lot about him. But I guess in my dippings into the New Yorker over the years, I wasn't expecting to find an article about Merle Haggard. I mean, all I know about Merle Haggard was Okie from Muskogee, which didn't make me feel very positive. But when I got to the end of that piece, I had some real insights, and he's a much more complex person than that particular song would lead you to believe.
In a way, Dave, this is what I mean, there is a theme through these pieces that I've done. I mean, certainly Dynamite. Dynamite equates Merle Haggard. Oh, yeah, I've seen it in movies. They used to blow things up with it.
Right.
And here it is, still a very viable force. Well, the same with Merle. I mean, I've always liked his music. I knew that he was a wonderful songwriter. And I said, God, what happens when you have this song? That's what everyone remembers you for. And you're still out there doing this. So here's this obscure character that was once not obscure. The same way, you know, more tangential sense with trucks, which is, I mean, you'll remember 10 years ago or 15 years ago, trucks. There was TV shows, CB radio,
right.
Knights of the Road, all this horse crap. And they'd kind of disappeared, but I knew that they were still out there doing this. And so the heat was off. So now you could go back and look at it calmly and in depth. So, I mean, that's exactly the point about Merle, is that he is an artist in every sense of the word, with this very, I mean, he had lived all his life by the time he was 25, and since then he's been on the road.
Right.
And very secluded. And yet he still comes out, and his personal life is a mess.
Yeah, evidently. He wrote about it.
And yet he can still transform this somehow into art and music, and make you believe in the, you know, the strength of love and the, you know, the sorrow of heartbreak. And there he was, and he was a really difficult guy. I mean, this didn't get on there, but in the story, but we had gone from Nashville to Atlanta, and we were going through Monroe, Louisiana to Waco, Texas. I mean, it's a long drive. I saw Merle at Monroe. It was like 3 in the morning at a truck stop, and he goes, "Well, Jesus Christ, Bryan, are you still here?" And I said, "Yeah, Merle, I'm still here." He goes, "Now, how long do you want to talk?" I said, I'd been telling him all this time as sort of a reporter's trick. I said, all he needs is a few minutes or an hour. And this time I was so pissed at him, I said, Merle, I need to talk to you for about 8 hours. And he goes, we had just driven like all night. And I was on the band's bus, and he was on his bus, and he goes, 8 hours. And he goes, well, hell, you should just kind of come with us from one town to another, and we could just talk all night. And I go, what? Merle, that's a great idea, man. And then 2 months after I had left, about 4 months after I had left, written the piece, they were up in Great Falls. And Bonnie, his ex-wife who sings with the band, I went up there to visit with him, and she said, Bryan, it's the funniest thing. We were up there, and Merle comes up on the bus one day, and he goes, and I'd been gone for 4 months, he goes, where's that Bryan? I think he wants to talk to me about something. So.
Yeah. I sensed that he was a little bit difficult to deal with at times.
Yes.
What you wrote about him.
And got me so angry that it kind of allowed me to be a bit more objective about him. I didn't just adore him.
But this is somebody that you obviously knew about and had an interest in before you wrote the piece. I mean,
I'd
you knew
listened
about
to
his music.
Listened to his songs, had his albums, and that's about it. And the glorious thing about this job is that I could follow some little wayward passion that I have and get to drive around in the truck and talk to Merle Haggard and George Jones.
Right. Yeah. Well, in both the case of Merle Haggard and the trucker, Lonnie, it seemed like that they expressed to you some desire to be doing something different with their lives at some point. Merle said something about opening some kind of a place for boys who'd been in trouble on this land that he owned, California. And Lonnie had a lot of different ideas about what he'd like to be doing besides just driving a truck. Is that going to happen for them, do you think?
Not for Merle. For Lonnie, I think it will. He's still driving a truck. He's bought his own truck.
I was going to ask you that.
I saw Lonnie a few months ago, and he's bought his own truck, which he swore he would never do.
Yeah, he did.
And he seems very happy. I mean, Lonnie's problem is that he works too hard. And this will allow him to spend more time at home. Merle will never open that boys' camp. Merle's full of it. He's sincere, but he's full of it. But I found it kind of interesting that people who have what seem to be ideal jobs in some way, or jobs that people would think are romantic, and find it very unromantic.
In both cases.
In both cases. And there's another impulse to this, which is, I grew up, I'm a son of a blue-collar family, and my dad went to the mill every day, and my mom worked at the junior high school cafeteria, working folks. And Lonnie works harder than hell. Dynamite is a working man's tool, and Merle is a hero to the working man, rightly or wrongly. I think he's politically primitive. His instincts, I think, are large, but he's naive. But this is all part of, and the New Yorker has for years, it's funny, it has a reputation of being a highbrow magazine.
Yeah.
But there's a book that's just out now called In the Old Hotel, or Stories from the Old Hotel, Joseph Mitchell. And he wrote about Bowery bums and blue-collar, down-and-outers, eccentrics in New York in the 30s and the 40s. Either he or A.J. Liebling, I think it was Joseph Mitchell, wrote a wonderful piece about the Mohawk ironworkers in New York.
Right.
And so it seems to be a magazine for the effete. But it really isn't, and I somehow stumbled into part of that part of one of the New Yorker's traditions.
Mm-hmm. Well, do the people at the New Yorker have some kind of demographic information about who's the audience? Do they know that?
Certainly there are more in larger cities and more in the East Coast and the West, but San Francisco, Salt Lake, Seattle, LA. There's 1 subscriber in the Northwest, 8 subscribers in the Northwest Territory. And there are lots of people out there. There are, several hundred in this town? Yeah. Once you subscribe to the New Yorker, it's worse than heroin. You can't get off of it.
Yeah.
So I'd say college educated and eclectic and interested, curious people.
Right. Well, I was going to ask you if Lonnie was still trucking. I just had to know that, so now
Yeah, he's trucking, and gosh, he was a wonderful guy. There's something, I talked about how I was kind of glad that Merle got me so angry so I could be more objective. And with Lonnie, he never made me angry. But there's a danger when you're doing a profile, and like we're talking for half an hour, but I'm talking to these guys for weeks and weeks. I am entering into their lives. I'm bugging them. I'm demanding their time. I'm costing them money in some way. I have become part of their lives. And there's a sympathy that you feel like you owe the person something. You want to erase some of the smudges, the dark parts of their lives. And as I continue to write, you just get better at that, and you step back a little bit and become more professional. There was a piece there about part of Merle where he was married, but he was living with his girlfriend. And I said, and he drove into the San Antonio Coliseum with her, waving. And I go, well, Jesus, this is public knowledge, I guess. But I still had to ask Merle, can I talk about this? And he said, yes, hell, go ahead. But it's a real danger of being too sympathetic.
Yeah.
And not doing your job as a reporter. And I think that Merle is the only person I know who has never read his own autobiography. He has an autobiography out and he hasn't read it.
Yeah, Sing Me Back Home.
Sing Me Back Home, and I'm sure he hasn't read this one, but if he did, I don't think he's going to be pleased by me talking about his face being so lined and how he used to be handsome, but so I don't know what he thought of it. And, would you like to have someone write 60,000 words about you? It'd scare you hell out of you.
I bet it would be frightening. Yeah, right. Well, I wonder if we just have a few minutes. I'd like to ask you a little bit about any forthcoming pieces that you have in the works, or?
I'm very glad you asked, because last Thursday I turned in a piece about Ben Michelson, who lives in Bozeman, and has raised a black bear, now a 600-pound bear named Buffy. He's also written a book for juveniles called Rescue Josh McGuire, and I inserted myself into his life, and last Thursday I turned it in, and Bob Gottlieb accepted it, so it will or will not run because there's a new editor, Tina Brown, at the New Yorker. So I'm kind of in limbo. I might be out of a job. Of course, with my massive talent, I can't imagine how they would not just keep me there.
Certainly have a great resume now. So do you think there are going to be some drastic changes there as far as editorial policy goes?
I think that there will be. I suspect that the political writing about this country will probably have a new writer. I suspect that the talk of the town, who's now going to be run by a British guy, is going to be shorter, or certainly more varied, and more attuned to visual culture, movies specifically. I think that because it's a weekly, I was just talking to someone and they were reading a story about Yugoslavia. Well, most of us, deep in our heart of hearts, don't care about Yugoslavia that much. Certainly not enough to spend 2 evenings reading it. Well, I think that Tina Brown might have fewer stories about Yugoslavia and more about Woody Allen. Mm-hmm. If the marriage and the remaking of it is skillfully done, fine. I'm really fearful that something calm and graceful is going to be lost. Mm-hmm. But you know, I'm a pessimist at heart, so.
Well, sure do thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you, Dave.
I'd like to take a few minutes that we have left to do a little library promo for everyone. I wanted to mention that starting September 29th and running through December 18th, we will be starting again our preschool story time. That's for kids ages 3 to 6, and we think that's a very important program. Coming to a library story time regularly helps kids develop a good attention span, introduces them to a lot of wonderful books that they can be enthusiastic about and the parents can share with them at home. We have 3 story times a week, and starting, as I said, the 29th of September, we have an evening one, that's Tuesday evenings at 7, an afternoon one, that'll be Thursdays at 1:30, and a morning one on Fridays at 10:30, so we try to accommodate everybody's needs there. If you need more information about Storytime or any other programs, remember our phone number, 721-2665, 721-BOOK. I want to also mention our group that we started just about a little more than a year ago, called The Club, which is specifically aimed at kids at middle school age. We'll be starting up again this fall, and we haven't got all the details worked out, but if you'll call us again at our easy-to-remember number, 721-BOOK, we'll give you some more information about that. That's a real good program for middle school age kids. Coming up at the end of September is Banned Books Week. We'll be doing some activities, and MCAT will be showing some programs related to the freedom to read, and we think it's very important to emphasize that. We'll have a library display, which will be a display of books that have been banned over the centuries. So you'll want to come down and take a look at that and maybe check some of those out. Who knows? That'll be interesting. Again, I want to mention that the library is open year-round, 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. We have 4 evenings. So Monday through Thursday we're open until, we open every day at 10 in the morning, and Monday through Thursday we're open until 9 in the evening. And Friday and Saturday we're open from 10 until 6. We still get a few people calling us thinking we're closed on Mondays, but that's not correct. We are open on Mondays now.